international reaction has been very muted. There are noises from the United Nations, but if you look at, as you mentioned, the countries neighboring Israel and Palestine have been extremely very mild in the reaction. Gulf Arab countries are also not very vociferous in their position. Do you visualize a fatigue situation that it partly contributes to international indifference towards the situation which is happening in the Gaza Strip and Israel?
It's not a question of indifference. It's a question of prioritizing. The international community during the past year and a half has been really preoccupied by the consequences of the coronavirus spread pandemic around the world. And the economic collapse of the international community is the priority now. I mean, if you look at Europe, if you look at the United States and elsewhere, everybody is thinking about restarting their economies. That Israelis and Palestinian extremists are fighting it out. That's more or less their business, that they could go ahead. But you are right that something new has happened in this last conflict between Israel and the Hamas extremists. That the Arab countries have essentially demonstrated their inabilities to speak with a single voice. I think earlier you asked me a question about winners and losers. In terms of, I don't want to say total losers, but in terms of relevance, or more accurately, of irrelevance, some of the Gulf countries have really lost the opportunity here, especially the Emiratis and the Bahrainis to a certain extent, because both of them are in the Abraham Accords and they have signed peace accords with Israel. So this was their opportunity and they've lost it. The opportunity to speak to the Netanyahu government with more or less clear terms that the barbarism has got to stop. You cannot just have aerial bombardments of civilians, destroy 450 buildings inhabited by human beings, destroy 6 hospitals, etc. Of course, Hamas folks are also killing Israelis in the process, but the Emiratis could have raised their voice. Maybe they have in private, I don't know, but in public they have not. The Saudis, on the other hand, as I'm sure you've noticed, have repeatedly said, yes, we want a peace accord with Israel, but we want to make sure that the Palestinian question is addressed as well. So there are no freebies here. Now, Syria, of course, is embedded in its own wars that's been going on for over a decade, and there are elections, presidential elections today in Syria, and I'm sure that Bashar al-Assad will win the election with 98.8% of the votes going for him. Lebanon, of course, is a total mess. And even though 4 or 5 rockets were launched from Lebanon against Israel, and the Israeli responded, killing one Hezbollah fighter on the border, but obviously Hezbollah's priorities are totally different. Hezbollah cannot move without Iranian permission. Hezbollah is a arm of Iran in this part of the world, and the Iranians did not want to enlarge the war with Israel because they have long-term negotiating priorities with the United States at Vienna and elsewhere about the JCPOA agreement, the so-called Iran deal, and they have other priorities. They don't want this war to expand. That's why they told Hezbollah, keep quiet, don't raise your voice. Of course, they are claiming victory. Today, there are demonstrations claiming victory that, in fact, they have won. But obviously, this is the kind of Pyrrhic victory that everybody talks about, that nobody appreciates. As I said at the very beginning, the only losers here are the dead people and the injured. And God bless them, and God help them.
Now I will hand over to Dr. Muddassir if you have any additional questions to him.
Thank you, sir, and thank you, Dr. Kéchichian, for throwing some light on the ongoing episode of violence between Israel and Hamas. Since you were mentioning Hezbollah, one of the questions that comes to mind is that despite of the fact that Hezbollah is a arm of military arm of Iran, it works as like a proxy of Iran. Why is it that Hezbollah was so restrained in responding to the current episode of violence? And despite the tensions between the Lebanese people and the Palestinian refugees within Lebanon? If you can throw some light on that.
Well, that's a very good question, Muddassir. The Hezbollah has a political agenda in Lebanon. Its priority is not military, because militarily they are strong and they don't need to prove themselves militarily within the Lebanese arena, but they have to prove themselves politically in this country. Politically, they cannot impose themselves because there are opposition figures against them, opposition populations against them, and they are paying lip service to the Palestinian question. The Palestinian issue is always used by these opposition forces, Hezbollah and others, the Amal party. All of them talk about liberating Jerusalem, and the Iranians spoke about the same thing as well. You remember Qasem Soleimani had the Faylaq al-Qudus, which is the Jerusalem liberation group, if you would like. These are the Iranians, but they are very quiet. They're not talking about doing anything against Israel. And let's not forget that their interests do not permit them to do this. So they've shut Hezbollah down forcefully. They've told them, okay, you can send 15, 20 teenagers to go and on the border, and as we have seen, they went to the border and they demonstrated and they threw some rocks across the blue line. And when the rocket came, the Israeli soldiers shot one of the demonstrators and killed them. And this is the kind of pardon me for the language that I'm going to use. It's entertainment. It's not really warfare. It's entertainment. It looks good on the 5 o'clock news in the evening, but it's meaningless. If they really wanted to, Hezbollah claims that it has 150,000 rockets and it wants to liberate Jerusalem. How come it hasn't used more than 3 or 4 of these rockets and launched 150,000? This was the opportunity, but it proved once again that not only it is weak politically, that it doesn't have a mandate to do anything without the approval of the Iranians. This is the best illustration that we have seen. If I were an Israeli, I would be very happy with Hezbollah. Hezbollah is my best ally